AMD's Ryzen 7 9800 X3D embargo lifts today, and we're reviewing it. The 9800 X3D is a Zen 5 CPU. It has extra cache on it, and it has some critical changes to the location of that cache that should pretty seriously influence the performance. As we talked about in a separate technical video, the 9800 X3D has shifted the extra cache under the core complex, so it's closer to the substrate. This leads to more direct contact from the CPU cores to the IHS lid underside, or the integrated heat spreader. AMD has also eliminated some of its bonding layers within the CPU, which reduces insulation further. And it has removed the structural silicon that leveled the top of the cache die to better mate the IHS and prior X3D designs. That's because the extra cache die and the core complex die are now the same physical dimensions. Previously, if you looked at a delidded, say, 7800 X3D or something like that, you'd see the chiplet with these two spacers, basically on either side of it, structural silicon, and then the cache die on top. So that has moved to the bottom, the cache die. There's no more structural silicon support in those locations. And we talk about all that in a different video. We'll link that below. You should really check it out if you're interested in the technology and more of the technical aspects of this. Today, however, we are focused in this video on the performance and the value of the 9800 X3D. So this is the review of the part. So all of that should help with higher frequencies. It should help lower the thermals, and then AMD is able to burn some of that extra power budget it now has to boost the frequency, and it can choose how much of that extra sort of power and thermal headroom it wants to eat in order to increase the performance of the CPU. The 9800 X3D, it's a $480 MSRP part. This is for the AM5 platform. Let's get into the review. We brought you this video with our brand new Inductor and Snowflake dice set. We just launched these high quality, unique tabletop gaming dice for D&D, Magic the Gathering, and other tabletop games. The dice come in two sets. Inductor, which embed actual e-waste inductors within sharp edge resin dice, and Snowflake, which embed tiny Snowflake the Cat miniatures we made, modeled off of GN CEO Snowflake herself. Each dice set comes with a custom foil card, either Snowflake or a Goblin token we made, a custom-made wooden box that we designed in CAD, featuring a latched fabric-lined top that flips to become a roll tray, and a lid with an etched GN Alchemy logo featuring PC parts and electrical schematics. We even benchmarked our dice to test for probability distribution of the rolls to try and achieve reasonable balance despite the embedded cats and inductors, and have a separate video coming up featuring Wendell of Level 1 text and some pattern recognition. For the next few days only, we are also choosing a low quantity of autographed Snowflake dice purchases at random to receive a rare box autographed by Snowflake's paw print, in addition to my signature on the signed SKU Snowflake dice. Directly support our in-depth technical testing and benchmarking and our independent reviews by going to store.gamersnexus.net. Thanks for your support. So to start this out, the Intel 200 series really didn't do well. It was a terrible mess of a launch. They launched something that was functionally incomplete. It was not particularly stable in some conditions. It had blue screening specific issues that Intel was aware of before launch and wasn't able to resolve before launch. The pricing was absolutely atrocious. And so even though Intel improved its efficiency, it screwed up everything else so impressively that the parts really just ended up being effectively a blunder. And at this stage, looking at the gaming side of things, which is what X3D targets, it really is a RIP Intel situation. That is not just like thumbnail titling stuff. I mean, in this current lineup and generational battle between AMD and Intel in gaming, Intel cannot compete right now. It is that simple. The cheaper class, the 5700 X3D wins. The upper end today, the 9800 X3D wins, and we'll show you that in our benchmarks. The only place Intel really kind of stands any kind of chance is at the lower, cheaper end with some of its older stuff. But anyway, getting ahead of ourselves here. So the only possible way AMD could screw up this launch would be if the price does not match the performance and if there are better value options that flank or subvert the 9800 X3D's viability. So let's get into the pricing table. So 9800 X3D's MSRP is $480. It's not listed as we write this. We're just gonna have to go off of that. This was all collected in the days leading up to review publication. So of course we can't know the actual prices on the day this publishes, but we're going off a few days prior. Assuming that $480 price, some of its direct neighbors and competitors include the others on this list. The 7800 X3D is $476 now and is out of stock with a listed former price of $450 on Newegg. The 7800 X3D has previously been as low as $300 to $330, with drops in August to around $360 semi-recently. lately its price has stabilized higher, which is convenient for the timing of the 9800 X3D launch because it makes the 9800 X3D look better. Insert your conspiracy theories here. We have a policy of making comparisons against pricing at the time of review, so we'll use that $476 to $480 figure today. The 5700 X3D is priced at $187 to $230. The 7950X is a similar price to the 9800 X3D, landing it at about $500. That'd be the one to pay attention to for non-gaming workloads if you're considering something in AM5, but maybe better at production-type applications. Intel's competition includes the 285K, I guess, to the extent that you can even call it competition, seeing as it barely competes with Intel's own parts on value. The 285K is $630 where it can be found. You shouldn't buy it. The 265K is $400. The prior generation parts, like the 14900K, have fallen in price lately. That's at $440, with the 14700K at $347 or so, again, at the time of writing, a little before this video posts. So that'll set things up. We have a lot to get through today. Let's get into the benchmarks. We'll start with a comparison of frequency against the 7800 X3D. This will help explain the performance differences we're going to see today. In an all-core workload with Blender, we observed the 9800 X3D maintaining an average all-core frequency at a fixed 5225 MHz without any dropping. The stability and flatness of this frequency is a result of the higher power limit, which is allowing the core all the power it needs to maintain this boost. The 7800 X3D averaged between 4800 and 4890 MHz during the original review cycle for the same test. It's significantly lower and less fixed, shown by the line's variability. In a single-thread comparison with Cinebench, the 9800 X3D also held a maximum single-core boost of 5225 MHz throughout the duration of the test. The 7800 X3D held 5050 MHz in the same test as a maximum single-core frequency. Between these two tests, the 9800 X3D holds a significant frequency advantage over its predecessor in both all-core and single-core workloads. We also ran a quick voltage ID comparison, just using software this time. In Blender, the 9800 X3D held a VID of 1.18 volts on average, with the 7800 X3D at about 1.07 volts. The 7800 X3D is power limited and also running lower clocks, which combine to yield a lower VID. Using the same Blender all-core workload, we measured a T-die CPU temperature of approximately 77 degrees Celsius in a 21 degrees Celsius environment when using a 360mm Liquid Freezer 2 at 100% pump and fan speeds. CPU die average was similar. The L3 cache plotted just over 50 degrees Celsius, with the CPU I/O die temperatures around 41 degrees with hotspot readings at about 50 degrees. The 9800 X3D cannot be directly compared to the 7800 X3D thermally by using internal sensors picked up by software. It would be erroneous to do so without accounting for the changes that AMD has made in its sensors. The AMD temperature sensors have been relocated within the silicon for Zen 5 and moved to cooler locations to prevent clock dropping too early. We talked about this in our 9700X review and provided a controlled comparison so you can better understand why the sensor readout isn't directly comparable between the architectures. It can be directly compared to the 9700X though. The 9700X pulls less power in this test, and so it'll be cooler, but it's still helpful to compare. The 9700X ran a T-die of about 52 degrees Celsius under the same test conditions with the same cooler. With PBO maxed out on the 9700X, we saw about a 13 watt higher power draw than the 9800 X3D stock. This landed the 9700X at about 86 degrees Celsius. It isn't perfectly comparable because the power isn't exactly matched, and we ultimately don't have an easy way to directly compare the 7800 X3D's thermals from the cache change without solutions that require more time than AMD gives in a review cycle. We do have some ideas here though, including some power matching between these two. Even still, the key takeaway is that for now, the 9800 X3D is not burning the cores at excessive temperatures, even with a stacked solution, and we have more we'd like to do. We'll see how the timing pans out though. Let's get into gaming benchmarks. Stellaris is up now. We pulled this one forward because the results are so interesting. So this is a 4x game. It is tested for simulation time rather than frame rate, and it's measured in seconds with lower being better. If you don't play games like this, then what you need to know is that the actual impact from CPU performance has a real-world, real-time impact because you can process the next simulation faster and you get on with what you're trying to do. So Zen 5 has already shown advantages in this test, with the 9700X previously scoring the new top rank in the benchmark and outranking all prior CPUs. Core count has some benefit, but beyond 8 cores for AMD, not a ton. But IPC and clocks really seem to matter. We saw that with Zen 5. We see it again with the 9800 X3D. The 9800 X3D absolutely crushes the prior top result with a 25.8 second entry against the 9700X's already barrier-breaking 30.3 second result. This previously appeared to be a limitation of the memory, which we can see reinforced with the 31.1 second 285K at DDR5 8600 versus the stock result at 32.5 seconds. The original X3D CPU with the 5800 X3D posted a 35.4 second result against the 40.7 second result of the 5800X. So we're seeing a repeat of that era, and that was impressive too. The 9800 X3D also reduces the 7800 X3D simulation time by 17.6%. Intel's best showing is the 285K with faster memory, but that's not a like-for-like comparison because we could boost the memory on AMD also. The 285K required a 32.5 second time for simulation with the stock 285K to complete the work, meaning the 9800 X3D reduces time required by 21%. The 7950 X3D shows why we haven't retested it. It underperforms overall for all the reasons we explained previously in our review of the part. This is why it hasn't been on the charts. The 14900K and 14700K are effectively tied and within an error of each other, and removing any limits wouldn't change that much. This is a great showing for the 9800 X3D. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up now, another of our 2024 titles. This game, even with all its updates to improve CPU performance, is still heavy on CPUs. The 9800 X3D distances itself from the 7800 X3D with a 16.2% uplift, gaining on the original 111 FPS average to an impressive 129 FPS average. We reran this one multiple times to ensure the result was right, but it ended up not even being our biggest gain in the suite. The gain on the 14900K was about 17%, up from 109.6 FPS average. The same is true of the prior 5800 X3D. Over the 285K, we saw a 23% uplift. Frame times were improved in this game, but not as much or as disproportionately as we saw in some select titles. The improvement is more or less proportional to the average frame rate, so there's no particularly impressive divergence in the lows. In other words, it tracks with what we would expect of a 129 FPS average. Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail is up now, released this year. The 9800 X3D breaks the previous upper bound of the chart. Let's run through the flagships. So the 9800 X3D CPU ran at 373 FPS average, which has it 5.6% higher frame rate than the 7800 X3D, while costing the same as the current 7800 X3D pricing at the time of writing. Obviously, the super low pricing of the past is not available, at least right now when we're writing this. The 14900K ran at 310 FPS average, giving the 9800 X3D a massive uplift of 20.2%. This is one of the games where Intel's new Arrow Lake CPUs are hugely regressive and impressively bad value. So the 285K's 270 FPS average gives the 9800 X3D an overwhelming lead of 38.3% higher average frame rate. As for the 5800 X3D, the lead is 11.8% over the prior AMD gaming flagship 334 FPS average. For some anchors to older parts, the R7 2700 and 2600 were around 145 to 150 FPS average, with the 2600 benefiting from a frequency advantage. So you're getting potentially multiples here depending on how far back you're upgrading from. The 3600 was at 170 FPS average. The Intel 12100F is down at 186. For frame times, we observed overall similar frame-to-frame intervals for the 9800 X3D and 7800 X3D. Typically, they oscillate between 2 milliseconds and 4 millisecond intervals, where 16.667 would be 60 FPS. The spikes are what matter, though. The 9800 X3D in this title had slightly shorter excursions from the mean than the 7800 X3D. The difference is hardly perceptible, but on a technicality, the 9800 X3D does deliver more consistent frame times in this title. Baldur's Gate 3 from 2023 is up next. We want to caveat this one with some transparency and a disclaimer. We saw a larger than typical gain in the 9800 X3D versus 7800 X3D for this. Obviously, we decided to clear the data because it made it into the review, but we spent a day troubleshooting it. We came to the conclusion that there's no evidence to suggest any testing errors, any uncharacteristic issues caused by the test or the game itself, so we're going to run the data because it's interesting. We'd pull it if we had substantiated concerns, but we couldn't prove any of the suspicions we had. So we checked with 2 other reviewers in peer review, ran hardware info logging, reran the test multiple times on both the 98 and 7800 X3D, and came to the same results. So then, here it is. The game has the 9800 X3D way up at 160 FPS average, leading the 7800 X3D by an obscene 26.9%. The 7800 X3D in both our shown dataset and our unshown additional tests have it in the 124 to 126 FPS range. This was after we double-checked it and got the same results each time. The 14900K ran at 105 FPS average, giving the 9800 X3D a crushing advantage of 53.2%. The 7800 X3D already had a lead over the 14900K of around 21%, depending on which dataset we looked at, and then the 9800 X3D also leads the 285K's 100 FPS average by 60%. Against the 5800 X3D, we're seeing a boost of 33.3% from the prior 120 FPS average. Baldur's Gate 3 frame times for the 9800 X3D also improved over the 7800 X3D, and this time, it wasn't just proportional to the average uplift. In the frame time chart here, you can see the 9800 X3D maintained a tighter frame-to-frame interval with reduced amplitude of excursions from any given prior frame. There aren't too many huge spikes for either of these really. You tend to not notice unless it's 12 to 16 milliseconds. Some people can notice 8 millisecond excursions from frame n-1. But the big thing here is that the 9800 X3D is just tighter together. Now, both of these would be an overall objectively good experience though. Because this was an outlier, we ran hardware info logging against the test as a separate run. In this test, the 9800 X3D average all-core frequency was about 5225 MHz, which is impressive for all-core. We think this is why the performance is so disproportionately good. There's a much higher power budget, so we're not trimming the frequency peaks, and the power consumption itself isn't overall excessive for the game. The two combine to allow budget for full boosting. And then plotting the 7800 X3D, we see a much spikier, less predictable average all-core frequency that bounces between 4500 and 5050 MHz under load. The highest single-core frequency is also variable. This is contributing to the behaviors discovered in the test. In Rainbow Six Siege, the 9800 X3D landed at 643 FPS average and led the 7800 X3D's 622 FPS result by 3.4%. There are limited gains to be found in a game already over 600 FPS. We'd have to reevaluate this with whatever flagship NVIDIA puts out next to try and find the true CPU ceiling. It at least gives perspective that you may not see big differences in heavily bound scenarios. The 14900K ran at 586 FPS average here, so the 9800 X3D has a 10% improvement. The new X3D part's also about 10% over the 285K. Compared to the 5800 X3D, the 9800 X3D gains 12% average FPS, and we removed some of the other CPUs from this one to make space for APO on results. As a reminder, APO is now doing little for performance in any of our tests. This includes Rainbow Six, which previously saw larger impact. The 14900K is about 10 FPS different with APO on. The 285K saw a change only with an error in run-to-run variance, so it's irrelevant. Starfield is up now, a 2023 title. In this game, the 9800 X3D leads the 7800 X3D by 16%, impressing again, generationally. The new result is 169 FPS average to the 145 of the 7800 X3D. The 14900K is led by 24.6% with its 135 FPS result. The new 285K did a little better than the 14900K in this game at 143 FPS average. That's still an 18% higher average frame rate for the 9800 X3D. Even with the DDR5 8600 memory in Gear 2 with the 285K, which required blasting the VDIM and some other settings tweaks, it still caps out at 152 FPS average. That was a great result. But the 9800 X3D puts things into a new perspective. Against the prior AMD 5800 X3D flagship and its 128 FPS result, the new 9800 X3D has a 31.4% uplift. Some quick reference older parts include the 2600 at 59 FPS average, the 2700 at 66, the 3600 at 70, and the 12100F at 71 FPS. F124 is another of the games with a lower boost over the 7800 X3D. The 9800 X3D ran at 464 FPS average here with a 5.8% improvement on the 438 result of the 78 X3D. The 14900K ran at 385 FPS average, so it's about a 21% uplift for the 9800 X3D. The 285K was massively regressive in this game and was down at 344 FPS. That yields a 35% advantage to the 9800 X3D. Against AMD's flagship from the 5000 era, the lead is 18.6% over the 391 FPS result of the 5800 X3D. Total War Warhammer 3 is one of the older games we test, but it's important for perspective on external bottlenecks, sometimes GPU, sometimes memory, it depends on which CPU we're looking at. The 9800 X3D ran at 490 FPS average, which is within error of the 7800 X3D. These two are bound by the same bottleneck, which in this situation is the GPU. There's only a 5% lead over the 14900K due to the same limitation, with an 8% advantage over the regressive 285K. The 5800 X3D ran at 457 FPS average, so another 7% improvement for the 9800 X3D here. The 14600K, with its recent rerun we ran, landed it up alongside the 14700K, with both encountering the same bottleneck as the 13700K and the 7800 X3D. Sometimes people ask why a 13700K could be better on a chart than a 14700K. It isn't here. It's just that we actually can't see the unbound scaling, so they look the same. This limits the usefulness of this test. This game has 0.1% low issues with the i9 CPUs due to their thread count. You can see that pretty clearly here. We don't test community FPS mods, so it's up to the devs to fix this. It is, however, a real representation of the out-of-box performance for these parts. We'll now get into efficiency testing and then the rest of the benchmarks. So this testing looks at CPU performance per watt, typically represented as FPS per watt for games, which would be frames per joule, or MIPS per watt in the case of 7-zip. Sometimes we have simulations per watt hour. These tests look at a simple formula of the power in watts drawn on average for the test versus the performance of the task. Adjusting either of these two parameters will have an impact on the results. In 7-zip compression, the 9800 X3D computed to 1298 MIPS per watt, or millions of instructions per joule, putting it barely ahead of the 5700 X3D. The increased power consumption of the 9800 X3D reduces its efficiency as compared to the lower power of the 9700X at 81.6 watts versus 98.4. The 9700X scored 1389 MIPS per watt. The 9800 X3D ends up relatively efficient in compression, but less efficient than the prior 7800 X3D. The 7800 X3D wasn't a higher performer, but because this is a calculation of both power and performance, either one can help to counterbalance a deficit in the other. Meanwhile, Intel's 285K measured at 1051 MIPS per watt, which is improved upon its prior efficiency performance in the 14900K, which was way down at 672 MIPS per watt. That's with the EPS 12V and ATX 12V line measured on the 285K. The AMD CPUs do not pull from ATX 12V in any meaningful way in our testing. The PCIe slot is isolated when we do pull from ATX 12V, and the fans and RGB LEDs are also isolated or disabled. 5V from I/O is also isolated. This means that there's some overhead in ATX 12V on Intel for the 200 series from the RAM and other small devices, but nowhere near enough to meaningfully move that needle closer to AMD. Decompression efficiency is up now, and this one the 9800 X3D ends up at 1482 MIPS per watt, just under the 5600X, which is benefited by its 60 watt power reading, and above the 7950X at 183 watts. The 7950X in eco mode is more efficient for its trade in performance, down to 133 watts and now at 1936 MIPS per watt. The 7950 X3D boosts a little higher in score because its power draw drops even more, now at 124 watts for 16 cores. The 7950X could also be limited to 124 watts and would achieve a similar score. The 7800 X3D is more efficient than the 9800 X3D due to its lower power consumption, but its performance is also lower. The 9800 X3D trades efficiency for more boosting here, and this benefits it in gaming as we saw earlier, despite costing more power. Intel's closest CPU is the 285K toward the bottom of the chart at 162 watts in the same test and 1194 MIPS per watt. Moving on to games, we'll start with Baldur's Gate 3. Baldur's Gate 3 positions the 9800 X3D as the new king of efficiency in the test, with a 2.4 FPS per watt result that has it just above the 2.3 of the 7800 X3D. The 7800 X3D utilizes about 13 watts lower power as averaged in this test, resulting in a smaller gap than we might otherwise see. The 9800 X3D at least maintains AMD's trend of X3D parts becoming the new efficiency leaders in gaming, and Intel CPUs first appear with 245K at 1.3 FPS per watt. The 285K is below that at 1.1, followed by Intel's last generation parts. Starfield efficiency is up now. The 9800 X3D is almost at the top, but not quite. Its performance gains were relatively high in this game, but the power consumption increased significantly. The 9800 X3D averaged at 98.7 watts for the duration of the test, with the 7800 X3D at 69 watts. This is what leads the 7800 X3D to a victory in this test, despite the performance uplift. AMD has lost efficiency here. Intel's CPUs first appear again at the 285K, down at 1 FPS per watt. The 14900K is at about 0.7. Stellaris is something of a repeat of that. The 9800 X3D pulled 54 watts on average, leading it to a 2.6 simulations per watt hour score. The 7800 X3D ended up at 2.7, or about a 4% advantage in efficiency, despite a reduction in performance compared to the 9800 X3D. The 12 watt lower power leads to this discrepancy. Intel's closest part is the 245K at 1.9 simulations per watt hour, with the 285K at 1.5. Final Fantasy XIV is final for efficiency comparisons in gaming. For this one, the 9800 X3D ranked at 7 FPS per watt, which has it below the 5700 X3D and 7800 X3D. The CPU pulls just under 54 watts on average, while the 7800 X3D ran at about 43 watts, and the 5700 X3D ran at an impressive average of just 39 watts. Despite higher performance, the higher power tips the scale away from the extreme efficiency we've seen in previous X3D parts. It's still relatively high in the ranks, above everything Intel and above AMD's non-X3D parts, but it's clear that AMD favored an increase in power for an increase in performance as it tries to find a balance between the two. Production benchmarks are next. These tests look at a suite of applications outside of gaming. The 9800 X3D is ultimately a gaming CPU. Our non-gaming tests don't regularly show advantages for extra cache, but it'll still be advantaged here just from the power budget boost versus some of the prior AMD CPUs, depending on which generation you look at. Blender is up first for a 3D rendering pass of our intro animation. The 9800 X3D completed the frame render in 12.5 minutes, about tied with the Intel 245K. Although we don't recommend the part, the 245K is cheaper at $320. AMD's 9800X2D manages to at least outperform the 9700X with an atypical render time reduction of 16%. It's atypical here because prior X3D parts do not necessarily see such gains, such as the 7800X3D at 15.9 minutes to the better results from both the 7700 and 7700X. The reason for the atypical gain is largely the power budget, where the 9800X3D has more power available out of box to clock up. The 13700K also requires less time. The 9800X3D is improved, which is better than we've seen in the past from X3D parts, but there are still far better performers and value options from Intel and AMD alike if applications similar to this are your daily use case. 7-zip can be one of the more sensitive to cache, but it depends on whether it's compression or decompression. In compression testing first, the 9800X2D completed 128,000 MIPS, which puts it within error of the 14600K and 13600K. It at least posts a 13% jump over the more power-constrained 9700X. The lead over the 7800X2D is similar. The 7950X2D performance is about the same as the 7950X and within about 1%. Intel's 285K has a large lead here, about 170,000 MIPS with DDR5 6000. The gain in our DDR5 8600 test was massive in this benchmark, which puts it at nearly 202,000 MIPS. That was pretty cool to see, but the 9950X manages to approach this result with the slower memory, meaning an upgrade to its memory as well would leapfrog the 285K. Decompression has the 9800X3D at 146,000 MIPS. It's between the 12900K and 7700X. The 9700X was regressive in this test against both the 7700X and the more like-for-like power 7700. The 9800X2D leads the 7800X2D by 10.2% and the 9700X by similar. Again, if you're heavily represented by this test, you'd be better off with a different CPU. The 16-core AMD CPUs lead this chart and set that example. The 7950X has been below $500 lately, so it'd be a price-comparable alternative to the 9800X2D that's more suited to this specific benchmark. Chromium code compiles up now. The 9800X2D requires 130 minutes to complete the compile with our settings, putting it at the same level as the 14600K and Intel 245K. The 7900 non-X leads the 9800X2D here and benefits from the extra threads. The 9800X2D also benefits from an 18% reduction in time requirement against the 7800X2D's 160-minute result. Likewise, it leads the 149-minute result of the 9700X. Still, the 12900K, 13700K, and 285K are all advantaged over the 9800X3D, as are AMD's own 9950X and 9900X parts. Adobe Premiere testing is done with the Puget suite. This testing lands the 9800X3D at 10,050 points in aggregate for the extended test, which includes raw, intra-frame, and effects performance. The result is between the 13700K and 9900X above it, and the 12900K and 7900X below it. The 9800X3D does actually improve on both the 9700X and the 7800X3D though, both of which are around 9100 points in aggregate. Intel's 265K outperforms the 9800X3D by 6.6%, with the 7950X above that. The 285K does impressively well in this specific test, with the 14900K alongside it. Photoshop also uses the Puget suite. The 9800X3D does impressively well in this benchmark, with its average score landing ahead of the 9950X and the 9700X alike. The 7800X3D's 10,162 point result gives the 9800X3D a lead of 17%. AMD does well in this specific Photoshop test right now, and so Intel's first CPUs show up way down the chart with the 14900K and 14700K. The 285K does about the same as the 13700K here. Intel's 285K was already lowered into the grave when it launched, but the 9800X3D has basically just contributed a significant aqueous mixture of hydroxide, chloride, and potassium with about 95% of water onto the grave. This impromptu hydrolysis reaction results in a product that you probably shouldn't buy even more than you already shouldn't have bought the 285K. Or, said more crudely, they pissed on the grave. The 9800X3D is definitely the new gaming king, and this time it's priced similarly, at least right now when we're writing this, to the 7800X3D. The original launch price of the 7800X3D was $450, and even at that price, the 9800X3D is actually a worthwhile improvement and doesn't feel like stagnation for once this cycle. Finally, we get to two experimental new charts we're trying out. These are brought to you by our dice kits, which financially support the extra effort it takes to play around with things like this. We don't want you to place too much usefulness in these particular charts yet, because they are experimental, and we can't try new things if we're always trying to perfect them first. But this one shows the delta in USD per FPS at various simulated prices for the 7800 X3D. The 9800 X3D is fixed at $480 in all of these simulations, with the 7800 X3D variable based on the number you see in the chart legend on the right. A negative value means the 9800 X3D is that amount cheaper per FPS than the 7800 X3D. Positive value means the 9800 X3D is that amount more expensive per FPS than the 7800 X3D. At near price parity, the 9800 X3D has significant value advantages in Dragon's Dogma 2, Baldur's Gate 3, Starfield, and even Phantom Liberty. Value is functionally the same in F1, Rainbow Six, and Final Fantasy. It isn't until $420 for the price for the 7800 X3D that the Starfield value gains would be mostly eliminated. At a $400 7800 X3D versus $480 9800 X3D, the 7800 X3D starts to make a ton of sense, widely speaking, as a better value, assuming that's how you shop. Basically, if you're trying to pick between the two and the price changes after this review, you can use this table to gauge the value. This is also an experiment. In this one, we're showing the percent increase in power consumption for the application in the left axis versus the percent increase in performance. The best result would be a larger performance increase than the power increase by percentage, although linearity is also good. In Baldur's Gate and Stellaris, with the latter converted to simulations per hour so that higher is better, the percent performance increase is either improved or nearly linear with the percent power increase. In Starfield, the performance increase costs a substantial power increase. We saw the same in Phantom Liberty. These are our two most power-hungry games in the suite and fully leverage the power budget. 7-Zip also saw this swing. Dawntrail is also bottlenecked, so can't be reliably used. Even when it's limited though, power is higher. AMD might be past the most efficient point in its curve based on this, but results like Stellaris support that it's still relatively balanced. There are some big boosts to performance over the 7800 X3D. Stellaris saw the 9800 X3D break through a glass ceiling and propel to new heights against an already dominant 7800 X3D. Starfield saw about a 16% improvement. Dragon's Dogma 2, also about 16% in our testing, also breaking through what seemed like a ceiling for the game. For efficiency, the 9800 X3D doesn't manage to hold on to AMD's multi-generation history of its new X3D CPU becoming the most efficient in our charts. However, the CPU is still efficient, and we'd still classify it that way overall when considering everything else on the chart. Production isn't as competitive as other parts, so if you're not building a gaming first system, you should just buy a different CPU from the 9800 X3D. AMD's decisions on the engineering side to move things around, to move the X3D part down to the bottom, closer to the substrate, get the cores closer to the top, cool it better, that is what has enabled AMD to have more thermal headroom so that they can push more power into those cores. And it's then able to utilize that extra thermal headroom to make decisions on where to tune the VF curve, the volt frequency curve, to try and hit a number that is still thermally and in terms of efficiency acceptable while actually pushing the performance. Whereas the prior solution for X3D, they were dealing with significant thermal constraints and considerations that would not have given that extra budget to play around with to try and fine tune further. So they have traded some efficiency for a lot of performance in gaming, and you can check out our previous video on this part if you want more technical detail on that. So Intel isn't anywhere close on the gaming charts. So the 285K, for whatever reason, is some completely insane $630 to the price. In gaming scenarios, the 9800 X3D entirely invalidates a 285K purchase. We already considered it invalidated in gaming, but now it's even further. So sometimes that difference is 40 to 60%, depending on the game. If you cut Baldur's Gate out of the data, just because we're still a little, it's a little weird. It's an outlier. I mean, we did validate it, but let's just cut it and say it's 40 to 52.3%. So that's what the range is if you get rid of that outlier. And now we've rolled the die. Let's just see what Intel got here. Literally, I'm not making this up, a 1. Now, unintentional but fortuitous self-product placement aside, the 285K is beaten there. We're seeing 25 to 35% when unbound for the GPU and ignoring some of those heavier titles that really benefit AMD. So it's still beaten heavily elsewhere. GPU buying scenarios, obviously the differences stop to matter as much. Intel does better in production benchmarks. We still wouldn't recommend the Ultra 200 series broadly, but there are some places you can make an argument. The 9950X and 7950X are also competitive in those, with the 14900K and 14700K also somewhat competitive in the same production scenarios as compared to the 285K. So there are some very limited use cases, such as the sort of buzzworded creation scenarios, as people call it, where the 285K makes some more sense. And you can see that in at least one of the Adobe applications we test via Puget. But Intel is marketing the 285K on efficiency, and AMD is more efficient in every test we've run. The entire last few months have been comically out of control for the CPU launches. We saw it open up with Zen 5 for AMD, where AMD fumbled the ball and lost 5 yards. Intel then picked up the ball and started running towards its own goal, at which point it tripped over its shoelaces that came unglued because they don't know how to tie them, and AMD then picked up the ball and somehow accidentally stumbled across I've reached the end of my knowledge for sports. End zone? I think that's the one that fits with this analogy. Hoop. Golf hole. I don't know. Choose the sports thing. Somehow, though, it all worked. Just like that analogy. AMD was set up for a slam dunk on this. I've actually done, that was not intentional, on this launch with both its own and Intel's fumbles. And they undermarketed the performance of the 9800 X3D by our testing, which put them in a position where only the price could screw them. If they had set it to $600, totally different story, even $50 or something. But AMD seems to have been at least somewhat cognizant of that. Overall, this launch was the most organized out of the last several we've covered. So Zen 5 was a disaster. Intel 200 was an even bigger disaster. And one of the indicators we have that a product is ready for launch is the amount of time a company sort of gives in the review process. A couple things here. One, from a sort of cynicism standpoint, less time means a lot less time to find problems. And when you're being critical and you have limited time, you have to be really careful what you're critical of, because there's a lot more underlying complexity you may not have time to explore as a reviewer. So you really got to pick and choose. Intel had less than a week on the 200 series for reviewers, at least in our situation. And Zen 5 was also pretty cramped. They delayed it. It was a total mess. And then they somehow still were late shipping out the parts. So we can work with cramped timelines. The concern is always, does this reflect anything for the consumer? And in the 200 series, what we saw was blue screens of death, some stability concerns, issues with anti-cheat software, and these are all bad things where a couple days before launch, you're finding that stuff. It's just this big red flag of what else is in here. And then Zen 5, where AMD seems to have mistested its own stuff for the marketing slides, and that caused a lot of confusion too. So this one was organized. They sent it out, I don't know, something like 2 weeks before the actual CPU's shipping. And the platform seems mature. There have not been any major overhauls mid-test cycle. It arrived, and then it was ready to be tested, and it stayed that way through the process without a lot of chaos in between. So it looks like this is a more confident launch with fewer issues to iron out that we don't have to worry about if we're not finding problems, basically, hopefully. So anyway, that's it for the 9800 X3D review. You all have the numbers to make the decisions at this point. So the 7800 X3D may make more sense in situations where its price falls. This entire thing, just to be really clear, is predicated on the price. The 7800 X3D is at the 2 largest retailers in the US at the time of writing this. There's about $480. If it falls to say 400, 420, in the threes especially, it starts to make sense to really consider it. But either way, the situation is the same. In gaming scenarios, 78 X3D and 98 X3D make a lot of sense. Production scenarios, like always, if you're really heavy and non-gaming, you should probably look at other CPUs. These are still competent in them, but they are not competitive by value. It's just not what they intended to do. They're good enough, though, if you do a little bit of it sort of as a hobby or whatever. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Check out our dice on store.gamersnexus.net. If you don't know why we did this, we have a video explaining it. And you can grab them on the store. We have both sets in stock and shipping out. By the way, it has been insane the amount that you all have picked them up. And we're excited for everyone to start receiving them as they ship out. So thank you for the support. I'm thrilled with the reception overall, especially to the inductor dice, because that was like my project specifically for 10 months. So very excited to have it out there. We'll see you all next time.